Alrighty, welcome back everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about a NIL case that some of you might know about, some of you might not know about. You might have heard rumblings, but I'm going to break down what exactly that is and why it might be the most important thing happening in college football right now. Then we're going to get into a little bit more of NFL draft talk. We're only about a little bit more than 24 hours out from that first name being called. Want to make sure you guys have all the intel before we go into round one. Then we're going to jump into Florida State and ACC. There has been a new development in that case where it sounds like it's possible that this case comes to a resolution, but I'll get you updated on all of that and what I kind of expect to happen there, and then we'll finish it up with a transfer portal update. We're going to take a slight break from the Spotlight Wednesday. I know that has been getting a ton of traction. Very much appreciate everyone watching that and leaving your comments. It means the world to me, so really do appreciate that. Before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to kind of have a fun interactive experience here, get on the show, I can answer your question, you can bring up a comment that I had forgotten to bring up. You can definitely use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. Huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to watch the show, have kind of a fun interactive experience with us, and yeah, it's fun for both of us. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in because there is a huge thing happening in college football that I think might have been a little bit overshadowed somehow. There is this huge NIL case that is going on right now that tons of people have been doing great reporting on, but Ross Dellinger over at Yahoo Sports, who is all over essentially everything in college football, did a great article a couple of days ago talking about this case and talking about the man that kind of has college football in the palm of his hand, which is Jeffrey Kessler, a lead attorney for the case against the NCAA. Essentially, the case, it breaks down to NIL has just been introduced to college football, and that's something that has turned a lot of heads in the direction of the past. When you talk about some of the players that had come before the NIL era, you know, the Johnny Manziels, the Reggie Bushes, everyone that would have benefited greatly from NIL being a thing when they were in school, have now kind of said, well, how is this fair? If you're going to pass laws now, how are we going to get in trouble in the past for having taken part in these types of activities and this type of thing? So one of the big things that has kind of been picking up traction in this NIL case and in the world right now of college football is possibly backpaying some of the athletes that were in college football and college sports in general from the past to kind of supplement what they would have made in NIL money. And it's a very interesting case. Obviously, you know, there's a solid leg to stand on if you're arguing from the athlete's case or the past athlete's case, just because this is a rule that I think all of us agree probably should have been in place for a very long time. There were tons of people behind the scenes pushing for this for quite some time, and the NCAA just kept dragging their feet, and now they're kind of paying the consequence of that. So now the huge question about all of this, in this case in general, is what is that dollar figure? Because when you read more and more about this case and you hear more and more of what ADs are saying, presidents are saying, even some coaches and things of that nature, no one thinks that the schools are going to outright win this case. No one thinks that the schools or the NCAA or the conferences, not exactly sure which entity would have to foot the majority of that bill, but it doesn't seem like they're going to win out in this one. It seems like their job now is to get that dollar figure as low as it can possibly be. Now, the dollar figure now, it seems to be sitting somewhere around like $1 billion in terms of back pay towards former athletes. So obviously a huge chunk of change in a time where money is hugely important, especially for the smaller conferences that are trying to make their way up to the Big Ten and SEC place in the pecking order. It's definitely something that could cripple them a little bit, and I think that's the biggest worry. And not only cripple these guys in the sense of the next couple of years will be tough, but there's a real reality where this bill is so large and so exorbitant that there are certain schools, there are certain programs that just can't foot it, that just can't deal with it, and can't handle putting forth that amount of money towards past NIL deals, because it would just put them at a remarkably bad position. I know we've talked about it a little bit on here, but athletic budgets or athletic department budgets are very razor thin. There's very few that, turn a massive profit every single year. You have a couple of sports in most athletic departments that make money. You have football that makes probably over half of the money that half of the revenue that is brought in from the athletic department. Then you have the basketball teams at times, baseball teams here and there, but for the most part, most sports lose money in college football, and that means you're working with pretty much razor thin margins for the most part. So if a huge bill is dropped in your lap, it's not necessarily something that everyone can handle quite as easily. Now, one of the things that was brought up by Jeffrey Kessler during one of his press conferences after this was tried, I believe last Thursday was the first time this was in front of an actual court and an actual judge, but he said he was a big favor of a proposal that was brought up by the NCAA president, Charlie Baker, a little bit ago, talking about a different NIL and college football structure going forward. And essentially the idea is to have a new subdivision that can be opted in or opted out of, depending on where the team sits financially or where the school sits financially. And it would give an idea of, if you opted in, you would have a strict minimum that you would have to put into athlete investment. So essentially put into NIL deals, possibly put into an employment structure, which we'll get to here in a second. But I think it's one of those things that opting in and opting out is obviously a huge piece of this, because there's going to be schools that can't foot the bill. There's going to be schools that can't opt into this if this ends up being the final case, although I tend to believe the Super League might end up winning out here, which I'll touch on here at the end. But I think there's going to be so much around finding a new structure for college football, and I think this is one where obviously opting in and opting out is a great idea at its surface, right? It's a great idea in the sense of, you save some teams money while putting some teams in the catbird seat, putting them up top and giving them a chance to kind of run college football. But the problem is there's those small teams that won't be able to foot the bill, but, they still want to be a part of the party. They still want to be at the table. So it's kind of putting them in a really tough situation, to be totally honest with you, if that new proposal was the one that they ended up with. Now, there's been a ton of talk around different structures and stuff, and we'll get to the Super League and talk about that a little bit. I think one of the biggest things is one of the most impactful benefits of the new model is you would compensate athletes directly from kind of a trust fund. So the schools within the new division would be required to distribute athletes thousands of dollars additionally, additional educationally related funds without limit. So the idea is essentially they have this, huge stockpile of cash that they would have to pull from to pay these athletes in this new structure that Charlie Baker has thrown out there. So at the very least, it would kind of give us, some structure to the NIL world. We would have an idea of what every team was working with, what every team, that opted in at least had to do in terms of the floor. But the problem is there's no cap on his proposal. He says that there should be no cap to the amount of funds that they can provide an athlete. So this would obviously not necessarily level the playing field by any means in the NIL world. It would almost tilt it more in the direction of the Texas, of the Ohio State, of Texas A&M, a very, very deep pocket school. So tons of things to consider there. I think this is one of the proposals that, it has some pros and cons. I prefer a reality where, at the very least, everyone has a shot to be at the table. I think the opting in and opting out is kind of one of those things where you're almost forcing teams to admit that they, don't belong in the real world of college football anymore, which is a thing that I just hope doesn't happen. I hope we don't come to that realization. I hope that teams aren't essentially forced to opt out of this and become not even second-tier programs, but maybe not even programs at all down the road. So that's not necessarily my favorite necessarily of the proposals, but I'll get to one that I think might actually win out here in a second. I think one of the things that we have kind of gotten into throughout this time is that $1 billion buyback and the future compensation for model for athletes, right? So we've talked so much about the buyback and making sure that or back pay and making sure that all the athletes that were not a part of the NIL world get compensated for what hypothetically they would have gotten. It's largely not going to be a direct figure for all these athletes, but just gets a little chunk of change that they probably would have gotten while they were in college. The problem with that, or not necessarily the problem with that, but it does lend its way to a full new compensation model in college athletics. And that's obviously something that has been talked about for quite some time, something that pretty much absolutely needs to happen. If you were to ask me, I think these discussions have ranged very, very widely and have been kept mostly private. So there's not a good idea of necessarily where they're going to land on this number, where which teams are going to be able to foot that bill, which teams are going to be very nervous about footing that bill. But it seems like the numbers, at least going forward, would be about 15 to 20 million per year in revenue sharing. Now, this could all change depending on the model that they take going forward, because obviously that is a part of the puzzle, the revenue sharing and the possibility of introducing that into college football. But Jeffrey Kessler kind of gave 4 different ideas of what can happen from here until, the next couple of months or the next year to get us to a place where we have a crystalline structure in place. And the first is the conferences can fully take over. It's something that has been happening for quite some time in college football, where you have these very strict divisions in college football, and you have tons of people making really big decisions for their conference, but they're not necessarily consulting with other conferences as they make that decision. Now, that's something that you can continue forward with. You can, all the conferences have different rules, and you're competing with each other to give your conference the best NIL rules for the players to increase, recruiting, to increase the ability on the teams in your conference. But it's definitely a very dangerous proposition, right? It feels like everyone would just be jockeying for position the same way that it is now. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that college football fans want to be gone from college football, is this idea that so much of the emphasis of what the future of teams is going to be is not necessarily on what you do on the football field. It's how much power you have walking into these discussions and how much power you have walking into these courtrooms. So it's a very interesting theory, I suppose. That is probably the number one that I am not a fan of, just because I think it would create mass chaos. It would create tons of rules changing every single day. It would just be a really, really hectic world that players, coaches, and conferences overall would just be remarkably confused by. Now, the second one is one that's been kicked around a lot, and that's the employment strategy. And obviously, that's one that is a little bit, has its pros and cons like anything, but I think it's one of those that a lot of fans are in favor of, because as we've talked about a lot on here, a lot of us are just craving structure at this point. We just want to be able to look at the sport and say we know how it works, which is something that has not been the case for quite some time now. And I think it's something that hopefully will start to change as more and more of these cases start to resolve, because there's plenty of them out there. There's plenty of stuff going on. In fact, tomorrow we will talk about the SEC and the Big Ten, a huge thing that could have happened out there that would have shaken up the entire college football world. But we'll get to that tomorrow. But continuing on with these ideas that Kessler kind of threw out there for ways forward, another one was revenue sharing. A settlement from the House case that produces kind of a revenue sharing model for athletes, which is essentially just, all of the revenue that is brought in from these schools, from these conferences in particular, with the TV deals, with all of the stuff that goes on behind closed doors that brings in just exorbitant amounts of money for these conferences. Well, now you'd have to give a little bit of that back to the athletes, which, in my opinion, should have been the structure for a very, very long time, but that's beside the point. We're here now, and hopefully that's one that they agree on, because it's crazy to me that the guys that are out there on the field that are, getting people to watch are not the ones that are getting even a little bit compensated for how much people watch. So I think that's a definitely one that has a lot of merit, and I think probably has the most backing in the college football world, at least from what I've seen. And the one that has probably the least backing in the college football world for probably good reason is Congress could get involved. They could, pass sweeping laws over college sports. They could give us, a really crystalline structure. The problem with that is, as we know, college football is not near the top of the list of priorities for the people in Congress right now. I don't necessarily envision them, coming to the table and coming to an agreement on a new college football structure when there are a million different things that they will be worrying about on a daily basis. So I don't necessarily see that as a viable option. Neither does Jeffrey Kessler. He said that even when he was laying out these options, he said this option is technically there, but probably not one that is actually viable or one that will actually occur. So definitely something to watch there. I think all four of those options have very different ramifications, obviously. I think employment would give us, a really solid structure. I think Congress would give us a solid structure, but maybe not the one that we're looking for. I think revenue sharing is a piece of the puzzle that needs to happen, but you got to have more stuff happening in terms of just the NIL structure, the transfer portal structure, all of that stuff just needs to be, refined a little bit more. And then the conference one is just a little bit dangerous because, as we've seen, conferences don't necessarily worry about other conferences. So Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti are going to worry about Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti's conferences. So it's kind of a dangerous game where you're giving even more power to the big dogs where they can kind of not only be at the top of the pyramid, but also control how the rest of the pyramid works. So it's a little bit of an interesting conversation, and I think all of this stuff will really start to come to a head fairly soon. I mean, a deadline on, the House case in particular for revenue sharing is in January. There are tons of things that kind of have to happen before that. They just have to, because when Jeffrey Kessler was leaving the proceedings on Thursday, he did make a remark that if this goes into December and nothing has happened since then, they are going to go to jury and they're going to win. If they go to jury in January, they're going to win. So a lot of stuff has to happen very quickly in terms of what is this back pay amount going to be, who are the schools that can pay that, or the conferences going to have to get involved, are the NCAA going to have to get involved, and can they handle it? All this stuff is going to be kind of happening very, very quickly, and change is going to be happening very quickly. I mean, it's been all over the place. There's been so many different things. I mean, we'll talk about the ACC and Florida State later in the show because some big news happened there as well. But all of this in college football, all of the different minor changes that are happening around the sport, all of the different, NIL ers and ahs that are being added or taken away, some of the conference realignment, all of that stuff, that could kind of be done away with this, the way that this case goes. Just because this case sets off the domino of, okay, so now we need a really good NIL structure and a really good college football structure, and then the desperation grows. And then we've talked about it when we've talked about the Super League, is one of the good things for the Super League is there are a lot of people in college football that are desperate for a structure. And it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world necessarily for them to look to their right and say they have this structure. They have set up a full plan. We went through it last week of what this would look like. Maybe we just go with this. Maybe this is just the best way forward for the time being to get a little bit of structure, get a little bit of idea of what the future of college football will look like, and then you can tweak it later, I suppose. But I think it's one of those things that you're in a position where there's so much uncertainty, there's so much question around what's going to happen with all of these different cases and all of these different what look like minor cases at this point with the Florida State ACC and all of that type of stuff. This is the godfather of all of those cases. This is the one that will set off all of the dominoes that will affect all of those cases, that will affect all of those teams, and whether those cases really mean all that much down the road. But we'll get to that a little bit later in the Florida State ACC segment. But change is coming, and you just got to hope that it doesn't bury some of the smaller programs, because I've talked about it ad nauseum on here, but small programs are what make college football. They are what make it special. They are what get people as excited as they do. They are awesome, and they're part of what this sport is. So losing those would be terrible, and it's something that we have to try to avoid as much as possible. But we'll figure out what that bill is, and we'll figure out very quickly who can pay it, and if they can stay alive in this craziness. So of all the cases that we have covered on this show, this might be the most consequential. This might be the one that we look back on and say that was the domino in terms of figuring out what the future of college football looks like. Now, the question becomes, after this case finishes, is what is the agreement on? Where does that structure happen, and what does that look like? Because there are a lot of different directions they could go, and there are a lot of people that would be making those decisions that might not be quite as big of college football fans as I would like them to be. But we'll get into that as it kind of unfolds, as more decisions are made. But a very, very interesting case that definitely you should keep your eye out on, because it could affect whether or not your team has a football program in about a decade. But we'll get to that as it comes. But we're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the NFL draft. We are only a day out from the first name being called. Want to make sure you guys are up to date on all the latest intel for the first round in particular, but also just some things to watch throughout the weekend as we get into the NFL draft. So stick with us, and we will be right back with that.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows where 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about an NIL case that could definitely shake up college football, will have a huge impact on what happens going forward. But now let's talk about the draft. There has been so much going on with the draft, so many things. There's a piece of my hair that's very distracting to me. There's so much stuff going on with the draft. We were only one day out from the first name being called, so I wanted to make sure you guys were fully up to date on what is going on. There is tons of talk going on right now. As we know, some of that is very much a smokescreen, some of that is very much real, but we'll figure out here pretty soon on what's going on. I think one of the very, very interesting things that I heard actually yesterday was Peter Schrager was on the Pat McAfee show yesterday, and he was talking about what he kind of expects tomorrow, and he said trades, and a lot of them. People will be trading up and down. People will be bouncing around, maybe some people coming back up into the first round to get a position that they absolutely need. But one of the big things he said was he expects all 6 top quarterbacks to be taken in the first half of the first round. Now, that's a crazy thing to hear, right? For the longest time, throughout pretty much this entire process, I've been working under the assumption that it was going to be 4 guys, and they were going to go in the top 5 picks, and then we would have a run on offensive tackles and wide receivers and all of that type of thing towards the later ends of the first round, and then you would get Nix and Penix in the early parts of the second. Apparently, that's not what Peter Schrager is hearing. So I've tried to kind of get an idea of how this could happen realistically without, some wild trades going on. And I think we've talked about J.J. McCarthy going to Minnesota, possibly, trading up into that 5 position with the Chargers to get J.J., although there's been a little bit of energy towards them just keeping that pick and taking an offensive tackle that they very much need in Joe Alt. But we'll get to that here in a second. I think the way I kind of broke it down was JJ essentially has to go to Minnesota, whether that's at 11 or 5, it doesn't necessarily matter here, but he would go to Minnesota. I think Penix would go to either the Broncos or the Raiders, which he's been tied to both of them, and then Nix would go to the other of those two. Now, Nix has not really been tied to, has not really been tied to either of those teams throughout this process. Now, there's been a little bit around him and the Buccaneers, or the Broncos, there's been a little bit around him and the Broncos possibly taking him at 12, but not necessarily a lot. Apparently, according to Adam Schefter, the team that has been tied to Nix the most has been the Rams, which would be that early second-round pick likely. It seems like they're going to go probably offensive line with their first-round pick if they keep it, because as we know with the Rams, they're not necessarily too inclined to pick in the first round. I think this is their first one since they took Jared Goff all those years ago. So definitely a very interesting situation for the Rams, but that would be wild. It would be something that I definitely do not expect. It would be 2 picks in Michael Penix Jr. and Bo Nix that I think would be mistakes, if I'm being totally honest with you. I think both those guys are great. I think they're capable of being really good quarterbacks at the next level. I don't think they're, top 13, top 14 picks in this draft. But at the end of the day, when you need a quarterback and a couple go in the first, couple of picks, some nerves start to kick in, and you make some decisions that you probably wouldn't make if other things started to happen. So that's definitely in the cards. It would be really interesting to see not only where JJ goes, but possibly if the Broncos feel really inclined, maybe they trade up to get one of these guys, and maybe there's 5 quarterbacks in the top 10. Who knows? But it's going to be a really weird thing to watch. I think that's something that everyone's been wondering kind of where these quarterbacks sit, but Peter Schrager seems to think that they're all going to be hanging out in the top 16, which would be huge for especially those 2 guys that I fully expected to go second round. But one of the other really interesting things that I've seen is Byron Murphy just continues to rise up these boards. I feel like for a number of weeks when you would see mock drafts and you would see all the talk, he would be sitting somewhere around 16 to 18, kind of late teens. I've seen the Bengals a lot at 18, which is actually another one that I saw on ESPN last week, or yesterday when they released their massive mock draft. They had him going to the Bengals, but a number of other people have had him going in the top 10. So I've seen a couple that have had him going at 8 to the Falcons, which feels like it's picking up more and more steam. I've seen a couple with him going 9 to the Bears, which, frankly, if you were to ask me if he's on the board and you already have Caleb Williams in your pocket, that's who I would take, just because I think you would set yourself up with a linchpin on that defense, especially that defensive line for the next, 8 to 10 years. You would have a quarterback for the next 10 to 15 years, hopefully. So I think it would be a great way to just set up the future for both sides of that ball and continue to build out that defensive side that is already pretty remarkable over there in Chicago. But if you have the quarterback in hand, you have the wide receivers they have, I would probably go Byron Murphy if he was still on the board. But that's beside the point. It seems like Rome Odunze is getting a little bit of hype there at 9, but we'll see what happens there. The ESPN mock did not necessarily agree with what Peter Schrager said. Now, they did have Bo Nix going in the first round. I believe he was at 22 to the Broncos. I think they traded down and hit in the mock draft that I saw. And then they had Penix going in the second round to the Raiders. So the confusion around quarterbacks 4 through 6 is pretty wild. I think J.J. McCarthy, we have a general idea of what's going to happen with him. I think it's either going to be the Vikings trading up to get him or picking him up at 11. Maybe some other teams get involved. I know the Giants have kicked around the idea of taking a quarterback. I don't expect them to necessarily in the first round, but I guess they could. You never really know what's going on in those war rooms until the pick is in, really. So it'll be really interesting to watch what happens with those two in particular, because I think they're both very talented guys. I just, spending a first-round pick on them does not necessarily seem like the best thing to do, necessarily. But we'll see what happens. Joe Alt is obviously the guy that is setting the pace on all of the offensive linemen in this draft, and there are a lot of them. that are really, really good and will go in the first round. But it seems like it's picking up more and more momentum that the Chargers will stay put at 5 and just take him there. And I think that's something that would be a huge pick. Obviously, they are going to go offensive tackle. That's something that they absolutely need going forward. And this is the best offensive tackle in the class. And I don't want to say by a wide margin just because of how many great offensive tackles there are, but this is the clear number one. I can say that pretty confidently. If he doesn't go at 5, he's going to go at 7 to the Titans. And I think the Chargers would rather have him than the Titans have him. So I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens there. It'll give you an idea of what the Chargers think of the rest of the offensive tackles and how big they think that gap is, whether or not they want to stay put and take him there or go down to 11 and possibly take the second tackle off the board or the third tackle, depending on what the Jets do. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens there. I think this O-line is going to be insane. A quarter of the first round ESPN mock was O-lineman. So it's going to be wild. It's probably the most coveted position in this class because of how important of a position it is, whether it's interior or outside. You have so many guys that have the ability to jump into the first round. Jordan Morgan from Arizona is a guy we've talked about. Roger Rosengarter is someone from Washington that has kind of popped his name in and out of the first round as these mock drafts have started to come out. So it'll be really interesting to watch. But the other position that we've talked about ad nauseum along with offensive tackles has been wide receivers. But let's do it again because it's always fun to talk about these wide receivers. ESPN did have 6 of those guys taken in the first round. The top 3 are pretty much set in stone. It is going to be Marvin Harrison Jr., I would assume, first off the board in terms of wide receivers to the Cardinals. And then you'll have a quick run on the other 2 in the top 10. And then it gets a little bit interesting. You have Brian Thomas, you have Xavier Worthy, you have A.D. Mitchell. All those guys were in the other 3 of the 6 wide receivers that were taken in the first round in this mock draft. I think Ladd McConkey has a chance to jump in. I think Troy Franklin has a chance to jump into the first round depending on how these teams go about it because we've talked about it time and again. Teams get panicked pretty quickly. So it'll be interesting to watch what happens there and kind of what happens throughout the entirety of the draft at the wide receiver position because it's really deep. So some of these teams might not need to stretch for one of these top guys because there are really good guys that you can pick up in the second round and the third round that could be big players for you. Now, they won't necessarily be the players that Xavier Worthy or Brian Thomas is capable of being, but definitely have some ability. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what those conversations are and where teams end up on all these wide receivers. But finally, a couple other things to watch as we go throughout, not only Thursday, but throughout the entire weekend. Adam Schefter had a couple highlighted that I found really interesting. One that is, unlike last year, there were 2 running backs taken in the first round. There will be none taken in the first round on Thursday. I feel very, very confident about that. In fact, one of the crazy draft things that could be broken this year is the longest time until the first running back is taken. In 2014, it was the number 54th pick with Bishop Sankey, someone that was not necessarily the greatest in the NFL, but had a remarkable career at Washington. That was the latest a running back has been taken off the board, at least the first one. And I think it's going to be Jonathan Brooks that's taken first, but he's sitting right around that 54 mark, whether it's 56 or 52, I don't know, but it'll be interesting to see if they break that record this year because, as we know, it's not necessarily the strongest running back class, but you can get some guys later in this class that could be difference makers, guys like Trey Benson and possibly Bucky Irving at the next level. So very exciting group, but they might have to wait a little bit for their name to be called. There have been 3 NFL drafts, 1968, 2004, and 2009, where 19 offensive players were picked in the first round. I think this year will break that record. This is something that we've talked about, the offensive line. We've talked about wide receivers. Those are 2 of the deepest groups. In fact, I have a hot take tomorrow that we'll get to regarding those 2 groups. But I think with all of those guys, with the quarterbacks possibly finding their way up into the first round and all of the craziness around so many different positions, I think it's very possible that we break that record and we have 20 guys taken on the offensive side of the ball, maybe even 21, where some of these edges start to slip a little bit. I think Byron Murphy is really the only one that I feel very confident is going to go high. I think, Dallas Turner, Liati Latu, Jared Verse all could fall a little bit depending on how these kind of trades work out. So it'll be really interesting to watch. I'm not really sure how it's going to shake out, but I think it's very possible that we have just the vast majority of the first round being these offensive talents that are just insane, pretty much across the board. The Bears have a very interesting draft ahead of them. I think something that not a lot of people were expecting to hear. They do have 2 of the top 10 picks. They have number 1 and number 9. They only have 2 others the rest of the entire draft. They have number 75 and number 122, so they can kind of take a little bit of the weekend off towards the end of it there. I think there's going to be so much happening around those first 2 picks, obviously. Maybe they trade that 9th and get more in the back end. Who knows? But as of right now, I would just nail these 4 picks and move forward to next year if I was the Bears. But definitely not what you want to only have 4 picks in a 7-round draft. But it's the position they're in. And as long as they have the top 10 and they nail those 2 picks, I think they'll be more than fine. Now, the Cardinals, the Rams, and the Packers have 11 picks, so quite the gap there. Definitely some teams that will have some positions to build out, so it'll be interesting to see how they utilize those. And then finally, Lincoln Riley is in line to become the first college football coach to produce three number 1 overall picks. Caleb Williams, Kyler Murray, and Baker Mayfield, obviously all Heisman winners, all remarkable players, and it makes sense. Lincoln Riley has dominated the college football world, especially when it comes to quarterback play, for quite some time now. So I think that number might just grow in the future, if I'm being totally honest with you. But Thursday on draft weekend is one of my favorite days in all of sports. I think it is such a cool thing to watch all of these kids kind of have their dream realized in real time and be recognized on the stage, get that picture with Roger Goodell, possibly get a little bit of a hug or whatever. But I think it's a very cool day, and I think it's something that all of us college football fans really enjoy. Just because the last time we really get to see some of our favorite players, walk on to that next stop, right? We've gotten so used to them being our players and being on our teams and suiting up every Saturday that it's really cool to watch them officially, go on to the next level, be playing on Sundays, and being able to kind of see them walk out as one of your favorite players and walk on to the biggest stage. So tomorrow, it'll be really, really interesting to see what happens. I will do a first-round prediction, just kind of break down sort of what I think some teams should do, what I think teams will do, pulling from some mock drafts, because to be totally honest with you, I do not necessarily have the sources that some of these guys do in the league, but there's so much that changes on draft night, but I'll give it a shot for what I think could happen tomorrow, but we'll get to that on tomorrow's show. So much stuff to happen over the next even 24 hours as we get even closer to this thing, but definitely tune in. It's going to be a very, very cool day, and I think this first round could be one that we remember for quite some time, to be totally honest with you. But we're going to take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Florida State and the ACC, get back in the courtroom here for a second, and talk about a new development where Florida State might be in just a little bit of trouble in the ACC case. So we will pick up on that right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the NFL draft and kind of gave you guys an idea of what it's going to look like possibly tomorrow. There's still a ton of stuff to happen over the next 24 hours, but we wanted to break down kind of where everything sits right now and give you guys just an idea of what you could be seeing. But let's jump into Florida State and the ACC. There has been a huge thing that has happened over the last couple of days with Florida State and the ACC, and Florida State is on the wrong side of this one. In the Tallahassee case, where we've talked about a lot on this show, the battle in this case has been largely over where it's going to be tried. The ACC obviously wants it in North Carolina. Florida State obviously wants it in Tallahassee. So that's been a huge topic of conversation. But Florida State has not necessarily gotten the help from the Tallahassee judge that they were hoping they would get. Technically, the judge, John C. Cooper, that is overseeing this case in Tallahassee, has approved the ACC's motion to dismiss on Monday, but did give Florida State 7 days to amend their kind of complaint against the ACC. So this is something that will be really interesting to watch over the next couple of days. Florida State apparently in their argument, in their complaint that they filed, the language wasn't specific enough. It wasn't necessarily what the judge was looking for in terms of being able to bring a case that he said is worth up to $500 million to trial. It's not necessarily, it's not the leg to stand on necessarily as they go throughout this. So they're going to have to find a new pivot, not necessarily an entirely new way to attack this case, but will have to at least, prove their point of why this is a big deal and why this should be tried in front of a court of law a little bit better over the next 7 days. So they are working tirelessly on that, I'm sure. And then the ACC will have 20 days to respond to that afterwards. So the judge made this very clear that this is not over. The case will definitely continue throughout this time. And it seems like it's probably going to find its way back into court. Now, he did say they do have to start mediation within 120 days. Now, they wanted it to be 90 days. It got pushed back to 120, and I feel like that gives you kind of an idea of what is going to happen in those mediations. Now, he did say they do have to mediate in good faith. They do have to try to find a good resolution to this, but the mediator cannot force them into an agreement. So definitely something that will be really interesting to watch. I think one of the really interesting things in all of this is Florida State and the ACC are obviously on wildly different sides of this issue. It feels like they are on two different sides of the Pacific Ocean when it comes to what they want, what Florida State wants, and what the ACC wants in terms of this case. And I think that's something that will definitely come into play when you get into mediation, because it's all about finding the middle ground, right? But if you're the ACC, why would you try to find the middle ground with the school that is trying to leave? Why would you give up money that you kind of need going forward? We just talked about the crazy NIL case that is developing that could, put a really big bill in front of your face, and these schools are going to need that money as much as possible. So the way I see this, good faith mediation, as it's put here, going is more the ACC sitting there with their arms crossed and Florida State doing their darndest to make this happen and make this, as low of a number as possible, because obviously that's the ultimate goal with Florida State here. Is they understand that they're going to have to foot some type of bill, and they know that it's going to be a hefty chunk of change. Now, will it be the $700 million that is currently being kicked around? Hopefully not, if you're a Florida State fan. I think that's kind of the biggest thing here, but I can't imagine that we will find this out during mediation. I have to imagine that both these people will get in this room that are just miles apart on this issue, and they'll just kind of look at each other for a couple of hours, and no one will budge, and we will find our way back to the courtroom. Now, hopefully, we can find some type of agreement, because I think there's so many things that are changing around college football, and so many things that are all over the place, that I think a lot of these teams, a lot of these entities, whether it's conference teams or even just players and coaches, I think they just want a resolution to a lot of these issues. So I think there is some type of push from particularly Florida State in this case to get some type of resolution to this issue as quickly as possible. But also the ACC, you're about to be put in a situation where you could be fighting more than just two of your conference teams. You could be fighting, a ton of different battles around your conference, and I think it could create a ton of problems. So while the ACC, is in a position of power, I think they are definitely in the driver's seat when it comes to this conversation. I think they do need to be careful in the way that they go about it. I think there could be a world where you drag your feet just a little bit too long and some more teams get involved, and then the court bills, all of the stuff that comes with these court proceedings continue to multiply. And that's just something that literally cannot happen for the ACC if they want to stay afloat, especially with the big bill that is coming around with the NIL happening. So tons of stuff is going to be happening throughout this time. And I think one of the biggest questions I've had throughout, not necessarily throughout this entirety of this case, but at least in the last little bit, as we've learned more about this NIL case and how big of an effect it is going to have on college football, is, I guess, just how much does this case matter in terms of, if the ACC wins out, fantastic, and they get all that money in the world, that's all well and good, and they'll be able to stay afloat for the time being. But as we talked about in the first segment, the Super League is a real option. It's something that is out there that the NCAA is looking for structure. They're looking for something to just get rid of all the chaos that's going on all around us right now. And I think the Super League is a real option to do that. And I think if that were to happen, it's kind of a get on board or get run over type of proposition for most of these teams, FSU included. So I think if you're Florida State, it's got to just be all about keeping as much money as possible and getting as much money in the short term as possible to foot the bills that are coming down the road. So it feels like one of those things where, not to say that Florida State is doing the wrong thing by fighting this and by continuing to push out of the conference, because you never really know when all of this stuff is going to happen with the Super League or with the new structure or with any of that type of stuff. But I do wonder just how long it'll matter. How long, if they were to find their way out of the ACC and into the Big Ten for a reasonable amount, whatever that may be, how long are they there? Does the Super League walk in 2027 or whatever and totally take over the sport and push them right back into the group that they were just not a part of? So there's a lot of things at play here. I think it's one of those things that we have all of these cases happening all around the country, and they're almost just little pockets, and then you have the big overarching kind of boogeyman in this entire thing, which is that NIL case, because it's something that not only will change the world for the athletes and the coaches, it's going to change everything about the way that conferences are constructed, NIL is constructed, especially if the Super League is the way that they go. All of this stuff is going to change pretty much at the drop of a hat. And if you're Florida State, you could have you could have gone through all of this fight, spent all of this money, possibly even given up some of the revenue that you were going to get from a new conference to get into that new conference for the time being. And then in 2 years, you're right back where you were with Miami, with Clemson, with all of those teams that, you're trying to get away from right now. So it's a very interesting thing, and I'll be totally honest, as we go through all of these cases and all of the different things going on around college football in the courtroom, some of it goes over my head. I won't lie to you. I am very much a football guy, not necessarily too much of a law guy. I have not dipped my toe too far into those waters as of yet. Now, I like to think that I'm becoming better and better handling these things and talking about them, but a lot of this is very murky, and a lot of this is very confusing, and the future of college football especially is very confusing. But all of these different battles that are being had around the country feel like they are, the minor bouts to get up to the main card, right? They're the prelims before you get to the big time fight at the end of the night, which is the NIL case. So all of this stuff, all of the things that could be happening are minor dominoes. And then the big one could drop. And then all of that stuff that has been, scrutinized over for the past, 6 months and possibly going on for multiple other months here in the future, all of that could kind of be done away with very, very quickly if this new NIL deal is agreed upon. All these schools have to foot out a crazy bill. Some of the schools have to fold possibly their football programs, and you're in a position where you need structure, so you go to the Super League or you go to the new subdivision, and all of the work that was put in by Florida State, by Clemson, by all of these schools that are looking around trying to find a new place to play might be for naught, or might at least not be for what they were hoping it would be for. So this is a really interesting thing. I think college football right now, when you look at it, is a very unstable house of cards. Everything is kind of holding up the same way it had been, 25 years ago. And obviously there's been some ers and ahs added to the game, but we haven't necessarily adapted the way that we should have. So anything could blow that house of cards over, but there's one big old fan in the corner of the room that could wreak absolute havoc on that house of cards and make us rebuild it from scratch. Now, to be totally honest, I don't know if that would be the worst thing in the world, because maybe that house of cards would be a little bit more sturdy and we'd have a little bit more of a structure to it. But some things are going to happen, that's for sure, and some dominoes are going to fall. But these dominoes are, small grapes compared to the big NIL, Super League, new structure, whatever is going to happen with that case. So while this is going to be very interesting to watch, and Florida State and the ACC will continue to battle tooth and nail and not be too great of friends going forward, I do think that there is a reality where Florida State goes through all this effort, finds their way out of the ACC, gets into the Big Ten, and then a couple years down the road is told by the Super League that, guess what, you're going back to what used to be the ACC, and you're going to hang out with some of the schools that you got away from very quickly. So it'll be really interesting to watch how that develops. Obviously, some of this stuff is pretty well down the road, but definitely something to keep your eye out on. There's so many court cases going on that it's very hard to keep track of, but the NIL one is the one that I'm watching very, very closely, because I think it's the one that has the biggest impact on what the future of college football will look like. So we'll continue to break down the Florida State case as more stuff happens. We'll continue to break down the NIL case as more stuff happens, but we're going to take our final break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about a little bit of a transfer portal update. Everything went crazy yesterday, and has been for the past couple of days, but especially yesterday. Felt like a lot of news came out, and a couple of guys jumped in that I did not expect at all. So we will break down those guys and everything that has happened in the portal right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Florida State and the ACC possibly could be pushing towards a little bit of mediation, maybe the end of that case, but I wouldn't necessarily hold your breath on that. But let's get into the transfer portal. There has been so much happening. We are kind of nearing the end of when kids can actually enter the portal. I think we have about 6 days left here where they are eligible to enter the portal, and we have commitments rolling in. In fact, a lot of commitments have rolled in over the past couple of days. So I want to start with the big board, just kind of give you an idea of where some of the players sit. These are the players that are still in the portal actively. Now I do have some intel on some of these players that I'll get to here in a bit, but let's start with the commitments, the guys that have found their way off this transfer portal big board in the recent days. And let's start with Bill Norton. The defensive tackle from Arizona was a huge part of a very, very good run defense out there. He has committed to Texas. It was something that we talked about a little bit. Seemed like everything was pointing in that direction. Johnny Nansen has been hired there at Texas, who was the defensive coordinator at Arizona, so makes a lot of sense. Definitely one that I felt like they had the inside track on, and they officially have locked him up. Now, one thing that did not go so well on the defensive tackle front for Texas was Jay Toia, who I'm not sure if I included him here or not, but let's just touch on it now. Jay Toia was a defensive tackle from UCLA, I do believe, and he has decided to stay at UCLA. So a huge, huge thing for the Bruins. Definitely someone that they needed to stick around, but Texas was very much after him. He was on campus last week for their spring game, so definitely one that I think some Texas fans had already kind of penned into the transfer portal team, but obviously that's not going to happen. Jay Toia is going to stay put, which is great news. I love whenever a kid gets into the portal, weighs all his options, and figures out, well, where I am is actually the best place for me. So definitely some good news there for the Bruins. Dallin Hayden is another commit. He has committed to Colorado, a replacement they very much needed because of something that happened yesterday that I will get into later. But I do think Dallin Hayden will be the go-to back for Colorado this year, kind of the featured back. Played sparingly at Ohio State, but was just stuck behind some absolute dudes, so don't necessarily fault him on that at all. Peyton Kirkland is another guy that committed to Colorado, an offensive lineman from Texas, who is someone that is probably the most physically gifted offensive lineman they have on the roster right now, and he just got on the roster. So Dion continues to do what he's done this entire time, which is just continue to upgrade that talent. Now, can you put it into a winning team? We'll find out. But I think this is a kid that could definitely start for them in week one, either at that right tackle or left tackle or even an interior position. He's a very athletic kid that can play a number of positions on that line. Jermaine Lowell is another one that committed. He committed to Oklahoma, a defensive lineman from Louisville who was just very, very dominant throughout his time, has been playing college football for quite some time. I believe has one more year of eligibility, so contract year for him. Tons going into this, and when you look across that defensive line for Oklahoma, the edge rushers are incredible. The interior defensive line could use some work, and Jermaine Lowell helps that a ton. So this could be one of the better defensive fronts that we see the entire season because of this addition, but also some of the edge rushers that they have are just remarkable. Excuse me. Tyler Williams is another one. He is committed to Minnesota. He makes his way there from UGA. He kind of just never really found the field at UGA, but was a very highly touted kid coming out of high school, and I think he could be a huge piece for the Golden Gophers this year where, no one's talking about Minnesota, to be totally fair, but who knows? Maybe they could make some noise in this new Big Ten where everyone's focused on Oregon and Ohio State and Michigan, that maybe Minnesota sneaks in there and wreaks some havoc. But Nigel Kelly has committed to UCF. This is a kid that was coming from Miami, super long. I think he's 6'6", someone that does really solid in the pass rush game, not necessarily to the level of a Reuben Bain or these elite pass rushers in college football, but is definitely a good piece and someone that I think UCF is going to love. And Gus Malzahn has done a really good job in the portal thus far. Henry Parrish, a guy that we've talked about a little bit out of Miami, that running back room got a little bit gutted with him and Trevante Citizen finding their way into the portal. He is committed to Ole Miss. This was the one that felt like it was pushing that direction for quite some time, and it is now official. I think Damian Martinez, that was a team that was thrown out there for him, but it feels like Damian Martinez is down to pretty much Miami, which we'll get to here in a second. But another one, Kyle Ford, is heading back to USC. This is a guy that started his career at USC before taking a little sojourn to their rival in UCLA last year. And in his Instagram post or his Twitter post, the way he put it was, "Sorry, I'm tripping. I'm back." So he obviously is having some fun with that. It seemed like he was very nervous to go back on that trip to USC after that year at UCLA, which makes total sense. But hopefully he's found his way back to where he should be and will definitely be a red zone asset for the Trojans, a super big body that could be very, very helpful for them. Isaiah Rakes is a defensive lineman from USC, was a former A&M player as well. He has made his way back into the SEC. He is going to be playing for Auburn. Auburn needs just as much depth on both of those lines as possible, especially in the SEC. So a good pickup. Not necessarily a guy that has hit his ceiling yet, but if you can get a little bit out of him, make him kind of that rotational guy, I think he could be very, very helpful. And then another guy that is sticking around, just like Jay Toia, Kobe Bryant is a guy, not the Kobe Bryant, obviously. He is the guy, a corner at Kansas. I believe he was actually named after Kobe Bryant, if I'm not mistaken, although it's spelled differently. He had been linked to Colorado and kind of this craziness that, there is some tampering, there is some contacting kids when you probably shouldn't. But he made some Jayhawk fans a little bit nervous there for a second, but he is sticking around, which is a huge thing for them. Definitely someone that they need on that roster and someone that could very much help that defense. So a huge, huge thing for Kansas, and definitely someone that could be a huge difference maker for them. But let's get to some intel on what's going on around some of the players that are still in the portal and could be committing here pretty soon. So let's start with Damian Martinez. He is the guy that kind of is setting the pace for pretty much everyone else in this portal. It seems like the Miami Hurricanes are the team to beat. A couple of crystal balls have been put in from the big guys over there at On3 and 247 for him to commit to the Hurricanes, and I expect that to happen here pretty soon. I think Miami has a remarkable offensive line. Him with Cam Ward would be a crazy duo in that backfield, so I think that's what I expect to happen. I think I would definitely be on commitment watch if I was Miami fans around Damian Martinez. Another running back who is probably the second best back in this portal is Penny Boone, a guy that is coming from Toledo, was a huge player in the MAC a year ago. He's apparently narrowed down his search to UGA and Kentucky. He made it very clear that he wants to be in the SEC, and it seems like it's going to be in Lexington. A lot of UGA insiders have said he did not expect them, UGA, to get this kid, and a lot of crystal balls have been put in, specifically from Steve Wiltfong, for Kentucky in this race. So I expect him to end up being a Wildcat, and I expect him to commit maybe sometime today, to be totally honest with you. Jaden Rashada, one of the guys that we've talked about a lot on here, he is on a visit to UGA currently, and it sounds like he might just not leave. Radi Nabulsi over at UGAsports.com says he is on commitment watch, so we will definitely keep an eye on that throughout the next couple of days. It could be that he is a UGA student by Monday, so we'll definitely keep an eye on that throughout this next little bit. But Keandre Lambert-Smith is another guy we're watching very, very closely. He has gone on visits to Auburn and Texas A&M, and those are the teams right now. He has apparently narrowed it down to those two squads. USC and Florida State were trying very hard to get him on campus, but it seems like he's locked in on those two teams. Now, I'm not exactly sure who would have the edge here. I think adding him to the Auburn wide receiver group would make them just remarkable, to be totally honest with you. Having someone like Cam Coleman and then having that almost security blanket in Keandre Lambert-Smith would be just remarkable. And then Texas A&M definitely needs just a little bit of help at that wide receiver position. So I think either way, it would be a great pickup for both these teams. For some reason, I'm leaning Auburn, but I don't really know why. So we'll figure out what happens there. Cormani McClain is another guy that probably has made the most headlines. It looks like he might be heading to the Sunshine State. It seems like South Florida and Central Florida are the teams to watch. So Gus Malzahn's still making some noise in the portal, along with that Nigel Kelly commitment. And I think this would be a great thing for both these teams. I think it would be a great thing for him. I think being at a school that has a little bit of less eyes, you have the ability to kind of just settle in and play football. And I think that's one of the things that kind of eluded him when he was at Colorado. And one of the things for him that apparently is a big deal is he wants to play both sides of the football, and it seems like both those schools are willing to give him that opportunity. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens there and which school ends up getting his services. But USF and UCF seem to be the leaders in the clubhouse right now. And UCF did not stop there. They are in on Jason Zandamela, a guy that is a huge interior offensive lineman from the class prior that will definitely play a big-time part going forward. It seems like UCF and Florida are the two teams that are kind of standing out there, so would be a huge pickup for either one of those teams. If Gus Malzahn can continue to pull in these guys the way they have, this UCF team could be a little bit more dangerous than some people might assume they could be. But let's finally get to some new names in the portal, because yesterday was quite the day. It felt like a lot of guys jumped in, a couple of really high-profile guys jumped in, and running back was where a lot of the damage was done. And it starts with Dylan Edwards, the guy that has really was remarkable, really, for Colorado a year ago, especially in that TCU game, just set the world on fire and made everyone think, this might be one of the best playmakers in the entire country. Well, he is now in the portal, and there are a couple of teams that have kind of stood out above everything else. Now, throughout his high school recruitment, he was committed to Kansas State and then decommitted and then found his way to Notre Dame for a time and then decommitted and then went to Colorado. So those are the two teams that you're watching in particular, Kansas State and Notre Dame. And Kansas State quarterback Avery Johnson has already done a little bit of recruiting. He's posted some pictures of them playing youth ball. I guess they were former youth teammates, and has posted them on his Instagram story. So it's very obvious that he wants him in Manhattan, and honestly, that's probably where I would guess that he would end up, but who knows? We'll see what happens with him. Tons of teams will be after him, but with that connection with Avery Johnson, it might just be where he's supposed to be in Manhattan. But another couple of running backs here, John Emery, a guy that was very, very highly touted coming out of high school, ran into some injury troubles during his time at LSU, but is very, very talented and definitely has a ton of ability. So it probably will be a little bit of a smaller program this time around, but could definitely thrive at that smaller program. Xavion Red is another guy who was at Texas last year, was kind of a wildcat, short yardage type back because the dude's about 240 pounds at about 6 foot. So he's a big dude. So any team that could get him would be very happy in those short yardage, red zone situations. I'm not exactly sure how much of a down-in, down-out back he is, but maybe he could be. He definitely didn't necessarily get the biggest chance to be on the field with all of the running backs that are at Texas right now. So I'm very excited to see where he ends up. And then Jalen Berger is a second-time transfer that started his career in Wisconsin before making his way to Michigan State. And not exactly sure what the market will look like for this kid, but has played tons of good football. And a lot of it is behind him, but plenty of it could be in front of him as well. So I think there will definitely be teams out there looking for him. Tons of teams after running backs, and some big-time names jumped in. So they got a little bit of help on that front. The defense had a number of additions, particularly across the defensive line. And it starts with Derek Harmon from Michigan State. One of the biggest names in the portal right now. And Michigan State has already had Barrow Jr. join the portal, so definitely taking some hits up there in East Lansing. But this is a guy that is an absolute beast on the inside. So many teams are going to be after him because so many teams need that other defensive tackle. There are teams that have not taken any. Texas has already gone in on the party, but we'll definitely need one more in that group. So it'll be really interesting to see where he ends up. Plenty of teams will be after him, but I think this one might take a little bit just because of how many different calls he's probably getting right about now. Tyler Barron, who was on campus at Tennessee for about 15 minutes before he decided to enter back in after the spring. He came in from Louisville. He was committed to Ole Miss during the portal, then decommitted, went to Tennessee, and now he's back in the portal. So this kid has bounced around quite a bit, and I think there will be a little bit of buyer beware here, at least with some teams. I think some teams will be a little bit more wary of someone that has been a little bit all over the place for the past couple of months. But at the end of the day, kids sometimes make that wrong decision initially, and hopefully he can find the place that he fits the best. But who knows what happened there. But definitely a very interesting situation for Tennessee, and not what you wanted, because although you have James Pierce Jr., you'd love as much help in that pass rushing as possible. And then Jared Wayne, a edge rusher from Miami. He was a huge prospect coming out of high school, was committed to Georgia for some time, and then decommitted, went to Miami, and just never quite got on the field. Has a lot of potential, but just kind of an untapped potential. But we'll definitely be watching that as we go throughout the next little bit here. And then on the back end, we had a couple, or really one that kind of stood out among everyone else, is Terrence Brooks, someone that I did not expect to jump in the portal. He is, in my opinion, although Dylan Edwards might be the biggest name, I think Terrence Brooks is not far behind him. He was a 5-star recruit coming out of high school, went to Texas, and played really good football for 2 years. Now, he had kind of a shaky spring, but was a starter in 2023 and was definitely going to be a part of their rotation in 2024, possibly a really big part of their rotation. Might have not started, not exactly sure, but this is a kid that plenty of teams will be after just because of the absolute talent that this kid has. I think his best football is still ahead of him. I think he will definitely be able to develop into a remarkable player once he kind of just sets his feet in the ground and really goes to work. But a remarkable kid that has a remarkable amount of talent. So very excited to see where he ends up. And I think whoever gets him is getting a really, really good corner. That's for sure. But that will do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast. Tons covered in this one. We will get back tomorrow, talk a little bit about the SEC and the Big Ten, some decisions that could have been made that would have changed college football very drastically, very quickly. We'll get into tomorrow, but thank you so much for tuning into the GSMC College Football Podcast, presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does mean a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the updates in content and everything you could possibly need in the world of sports. We have you covered, so definitely check out all of the shows that we have running on the GSMC network. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Let's go.